The sound that everyone in the lobby would later try to describe, and fail to describe accurately because it had happened too fast, was the crack of a heavy crystal tumbler hitting Italian marble and breaking into 100 bright pieces, and underneath it, half a beat behind, the duller sound of a woman's shoulder striking the edge of the concierge desk. For one held breath, nobody in the great timber and glass atrium of the Selkirk Crown moved. The fire kept crackling in the stone hearth the size of a doorway. The snow kept falling past the 40-foot windows in slow gray sheets, and a woman in a faded olive parka, the kind you buy at a surplus store and wear for 15 winters, slowly straightened herself, set one hand flat on the desk to steady her balance, and looked at the person who had just shoved her with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was something patient and very old, the kind of look that takes a lifetime to earn and costs more than most people ever pay. Nobody in that lobby knew who she was. That was rather the point. They had watched her come stamping in out of the blizzard 20 minutes earlier, snow crusted on her hood, dragging a single battered roller bag with a wheel that didn't turn right. And they had filed her instantly into the category of people who did not belong in a place where a single night cost more than some people earned in a month. They saw the parka and the scuffed boots and the absence of anything that announced money, and they decided in under 3 seconds who she was and how much she mattered. They were wrong about all of it, wrong in a way that, by the time the sun came up over the Bow Valley the next morning, would begin costing a great many people a very great deal of money, not slowly, not over a quarter, but in one clean, vertical, unforgettable day. Her name was Maxine Okoro, and the storm had not been part of anyone's plan. It had rolled down off the Continental Divide that afternoon with the kind of speed the mountains specialize in, turning a mild spring drive along the Trans-Canada into a whiteout that closed the highway in both directions and stranded a few hundred travelers wherever they happened to be when the gates came down. Maxine had been driving back alone from 3 days at a cabin she kept under a name that was not her own, a small place with no cell service where nobody asked her anything, and she could remember what her own thoughts sounded like. She had no driver that weekend, no assistant, no security, no one. She traveled that way on purpose because she had learned a long time ago that you never see the truth about how the world works from inside a motorcade. You see it standing in line, soaked through, holding a bag that won't roll, watching how the people behind a counter look at you when they think you can't do anything about it. The Selkirk Crown was the only lodging within 40 kilometers, still showing a vacancy when her phone, before it lost signal entirely, had grudgingly loaded the booking page. She had used the place once before, years earlier, under that other name. She booked the last available room, a suite, full rate, paid in advance, and pointed her ordinary mid-size car up the winding access road through the trees with her knuckles white on the wheel. And she did not tell anyone she was coming. She never did. It was, in a strange way, the most honest thing she still did with her life. What she did not bother to mention, because there had been no reason to, was that she owned just under 14% of the company that owned the Selkirk Crown. The lodge was the flagship of Coronet Hospitality Group, an outfit she had been studying with quiet attention for the better part of 2 years, the way she studied everything before she let her money near it. Coronet was beautiful and badly run and bleeding cash, and a rescue was in motion. $300 million of it, structured through a holding company that appeared on no press release and no investor page, scheduled to be signed at 9 o'clock the following morning, in a boardroom in downtown Calgary. She had been in the room for none of the photo opportunities. She preferred it that way. She had learned that an arrival nobody expects tells you everything, and an arrival everybody prepares for tells you nothing at all. The woman behind the front desk had a name tag that read Marissa, and the polished, frictionless warmth of someone who had trained herself to perform graciousness, the way other people perform a backhand in tennis. Her eyes went over Maxine in a single practice sweep. The parka, the bag, the bare hands, the total absence of anything that gleamed. and something behind them cooled by several degrees, quietly, like a thermostat nudged down when no one is looking. She did not smile. She asked for the reservation in the flat, faintly weary tone of a person who has already decided the conversation will be a waste of her evening. Maxine slid her phone across the counter. The confirmation sat right there on the screen. Suite booked, full rate, paid. Marissa looked at it for longer than looking required. Off to the side, sunk into one of the deep leather chairs near the fire. A heavy-set man in a camel-colored coat with a glass of amber scotch resting on his knee turned his head and gave a slow, theatrical grin. "Staff entrance is round the back, dear," he said, not bothering to lower his voice, enjoying it. "Past the kitchens. They'll sort you out." The young couple near him, both in expensive ski resort knitwear they almost certainly had not skied in, found something fascinating about their phones and did not look up. Maxine did not answer the man. She kept her eyes on Marissa and waited, the way water waits. Marissa handed the phone back without quite meeting her gaze. "I'll have to verify this," she said, as though a fully paid digital reservation were a hand-drawn forgery. "It may take a moment." The moment took 11 minutes. Maxine stood in the center of that vast, warm room with snowmelt dripping off her parka onto the marble, while a bellhop wheeled a matching set of designer luggage past her for the couple, and the man in the camel coat got a fresh scotch carried over on a small silver tray, and the fire threw its gold light over all of it. When Marissa finally returned, she wore the specific, almost insulted expression of a person who had gone looking for a problem and been annoyed to come back empty-handed. "The booking does appear to be in the system," she said, and the word "appear" did an enormous amount of work in that sentence. "However, we've had to reassign the suite. There's a unit available in the lower lodge. I'll have someone walk you over." "My reservation is for the Alpine suite," Maxine said. Her voice was low and even, with nothing sharp in it. 311. "I'd like the room I paid for, please." Something tightened along Marissa's jaw. She leaned in slightly and dropped her voice so that only Maxine could hear it. "I'd think very carefully," she said, "about how difficult you want to make this." Maxine took one small step forward, not a threat, just presence, just the simple fact of a body refusing to shrink. 311, she said again gently. "It's mine." And then Marissa moved. She came around the end of the desk, faster than anyone expected. The way only thoroughly certain people move, people who have never once in their lives had to picture a consequence. She took Maxine by the upper arm to steer her toward the door like a piece of furniture being repositioned. And when Maxine instinctively pulled back, Marissa shoved, harder than she meant to, perhaps, exactly as hard as she meant to. And Maxine went sideways into the corner of the concierge desk, and the crystal tumbler someone had left there went off the edge and shattered across the marble, like the whole room had cracked down the middle. The man in the camel coat made a small startled noise. The couple in the knitwear went rigid. Somewhere near the elevators a guest had already lifted a phone, and its little white recording light glowed in the firelight like a single cold star. Maxine straightened. She set her hand on the desk. She drew one slow breath, and she looked at Marissa, and what she said came out so quietly that the people nearest had to lean in to catch it. "You've no idea," she said, "what you just stepped on." Marissa did not apologize. She did not even blink. She informed Maxine, in the calm, level tone of a woman who had never once been told she was wrong about anything that mattered, that if there were any further disturbance she would have security remove her from the property, and that the lower lodge room was the final offer. One of the other guests was still filming. Maxine saw the light. She said nothing more. She picked up the handle of her bag with the broken wheel, and she walked, without hurry, to a bench near the cold edge of the great windows, and she sat down with her hands folded in her lap and the snow coming down behind her, and she watched. For the next half hour, Marissa ran the lobby as though nothing had happened. She brought the man in the camel coat a plate of warm spiced nuts and laughed, brief and calibrated, at something he said. She walked the couple to the elevator herself and told them to ring down for anything at all. When she passed Maxine's bench, she did not look at her. navigating around her the way a person navigates a wet patch on the floor. The duty manager came through once, exchanged a few words with Marissa near the desk, glanced toward the bench, and did not come over. Whatever Marissa had told him had been enough, and near the archway to the dining room, half hidden behind a column of polished cedar, a young woman in a server's vest watched the whole thing with the particular, helpless discomfort of someone who knows something is wrong and has not yet found the words for it. Her name was Camille. She was 23. She had been at the Selkirk Crown for 10 months. 10 months of being told to defer to Marissa, who had run the front of house for the better part of a decade and carried herself accordingly. But there was something about the woman on the bench that snagged on the edge of Camille's memory and would not come loose. She had seen that face before. Not here, somewhere flat and printed, a photograph, a screen. The kind of face that turns up beside a headline. She kept glancing back. The woman sat perfectly still, hands folded, gaze on the falling snow, and there was something in the quality of that stillness that did not belong to a person who had simply accepted being humiliated. It was the stillness of someone arriving at a decision. Camille slipped behind the front desk while Marissa was occupied at the bar, and she pulled up the property management tablet, and she scrolled to the reservations flagged for VIP handling, and she found the name attached to Suite 3111. And then she went very cold. She read it once. She looked across the lobby at the woman in the olive parka. She read it again. The system had a small gray star next to the booking, an internal flag she had only ever seen twice before, and when she tapped it, it linked through to a profile in the corporate ownership registry. The kind of thing front desk staff were never supposed to be able to open, except that Marissa had logged into it weeks ago and never signed out. The page loaded slowly over the lodge's storm-battered satellite link, and when it finished loading, Camille set the tablet flat on the counter and pressed both palms against it to steady her hands. Maxine Okoro had not always been the woman that the financial pages would soon be writing about in the present tense, as though her success had arrived fully formed and inevitable. She had grown up in the north end of a prairie city where winter meant something different than it meant at a place like the Selkirk Crown, meant a furnace that quit in January and a landlord who took 3 weeks to fix it, meant boots stuffed with newspaper, meant a mother who worked the overnight cleaning shift at a hospital for 19 years and came home gray-faced at dawn and still found the energy to ask about homework. Her father had gone before she was old enough to keep a clear memory of him. She had gone to schools that ran short of textbooks by October and long on need by necessity, and she had been the kind of student that some teachers quietly pushed forward and others quietly resented, and she had learned early to read both of those impulses on a person's face in the first few seconds, because survival sometimes depended on it. She had clawed her way into an engineering program on a scholarship that required a grade average she was not allowed to slip below even once, in a department that had not graduated a single black woman from that stream in the 8 years before her. She graduated anyway. She walked into a technology sector that had no particular interest in people who looked like her, and instead of asking it to make room, she decided the surest path was to quietly become one of the people who owned it. Her company had started in a rented unit above a laundromat, with a team of 4 who slept under their desks the first winter, because none of them could afford anything else, and it had built a piece of logistics and data software that nobody wanted right up until the moment everybody did. By the 4th year, they were profitable. By the 7th, they were enormous. By the 9th, she had taken the company public and appeared, briefly and without ceremony, on a list of self-made billionaires in a business magazine she had been too busy to read. She did not celebrate. She kept the same modest apartment for 2 years after she could have bought the building, because she had grown up surrounded by people performing a prosperity they did not have, and she had always found the performance exhausting. So she performed nothing. She moved into the quiet world of strategic stakes and silent equity, buying positions in companies across hospitality and transport and real estate. companies that frequently had no idea whose money sat behind the fund that held their shares. Coronet Hospitality was one of those companies, and she had learned, somewhere along the way, the single most useful thing she knew: that there is an enormous gap between what an organization says it values and what it actually does when it is convinced no one important is in the room. She made it her business to be in the room when they thought it was empty. Now, sitting on a cold bench with snowmelt soaking through the hem of her parka, she understood with perfect, unhurried clarity exactly what she was going to do. She reached into the pocket of the parka and found her phone, and saw, with no surprise at all, that the storm had given her one thin bar of signal. She opened a message to the man who had been her lead counsel for 11 years, a careful, unhurried lawyer named Desmond Lowe, and she typed 5 words. He would understand them. He had, in some part of himself, been waiting for them since the deal began. She put the phone back and folded her hands and watched the snow, and the great fire burned on, and nobody in that beautiful room had the faintest idea that the floor had already begun to move beneath them. The lower lodge room was clean and small, and smelled faintly of cedar and cold. Maxine sat on the edge of the bed without turning on more than one lamp, and made 2 calls while she still had signal. The first was to Desmond, confirming what the message had already said. The second was to her assistant, an unflappable woman named Joelle, who answered on the first ring at 11:30 at night, the way she always did. "Pull the 9 o'clock, Maxine said. "All of it. Have Desmond issue a formal withdrawal of the offer before 3. Standard language. No explanation." Joelle did not ask a single question. She never did. That was one of the reasons Maxine trusted her without reservation. Up in the main lodge, Camille stood behind the desk with the tablet in her hands and a sick, spreading cold in her chest. She had gone to the duty manager first, quietly, and told him what she'd found, and he had told her, with a patient little sigh, that Marissa had handled a difficult guest appropriately, and that Camille should finish her shift and not go looking for trouble. She had found Marissa in the back office counting the float and told her directly, her voice not entirely steady, who the woman in the parka was. Marissa had looked at her with a kind of tolerant pity, the way an adult looks at a child who has said something embarrassingly wrong. "A tech billionaire," she said slowly, as if the words themselves were the proof, "does not drive herself up a mountain in a blizzard and check in alone in a coat from a thrift bin." And then she had looked at Camille a moment longer and said, "Let it go. Don't make this your problem." Camille had nodded. She had walked back out to the floor, and then she had done the precise thing she had just been told not to do. She sat in the empty staff break room and wrote a careful incident report, factual and time-stamped, and she attached a screenshot of the ownership registry page and a screenshot of the paid reservation, and she sent it to the regional director of guest services, the head of human resources, and the executive office of the chief executive. She sent it at 12:41 in the morning, and then she sat very still in the fluorescent quiet, the way a person sits after they have done something they cannot take back, and she breathed. The withdrawal notice from Desmond Lowe's firm landed in the inbox of Gordon Price, chief executive of Coronet Hospitality Group, at 3 a.m. exactly. He had set an alert for anything from that firm, because the signing was at 9 and a deal of that size warranted vigilance. He sat up in the dark of a bedroom that cost more per month than Camille's mother made in a year, and he read it, and then he read it again, and then he turned on the lamp and read it a 3rd time. It was brief, formal, and absolutely without ambiguity. The investor was withdrawing entirely from the proposed transaction, effective immediately, with no further comment at this time. He sat in the lamplight for a long while. Then he opened the incident report that had been forwarded up the chain a little after 12:30, the one nobody at the executive level had bothered to read yet, and he read the whole thing, and he looked at the screenshot of the registry, and he felt the specific swimming vertigo of a man realizing that the ground he had been standing on has been quietly washing away for a long time, and has chosen tonight, of all nights, to finally let go. By 5:30, he had been on the phone for an hour with the board chair and general counsel. By 6, 2 directors had been pulled out of bed. By 6:45, someone in the investor relations office, with an unfortunate instinct for being helpful, had mentioned to a contact at a wire service that there might be a development with the morning's planned announcement, and that contact had done the arithmetic. A major unannounced rescue financing collapsing the night before signing, and had filed a short, restrained item under the headline, Coronet Hospitality faces uncertain open after reported financing withdrawal, sourced only to people familiar with the matter, which in financial reporting is sometimes more than enough. The Toronto market opened at 9:30. By 9:44, Coronet was down 9%. By 10:20, it was off 15. 2 larger outlets picked up the wire item. A former Coronet director, who had resigned 18 months earlier over a governance fight, gave a quote that was measured and devastating in exactly equal proportion. By noon, the stock was down 23%, and the company had shed somewhere between $40 and $70 million of value, depending on which minute you measured, and the only question anyone in those circles was asking was not whether Coronet had a problem, but how deep it ran and how fast it would be priced in. The board convened an emergency session in a glass-walled room on the 30th floor. Gordon Price sat at the head of the table and watched people he had known for 15 years look at him with the particular expression powerful people wear when they have just worked out who is going to absorb the cost of a disaster. The question that kept rising and sinking and rising again, like something that refused to stay under, was simply, why? The terms had been agreed. The contracts had been through council 4 times, and then, the night before signing, a withdrawal with no reason given. The general counsel had Camille's incident report in front of her. She read it aloud. The room was very quiet when she finished. Someone asked for the lobby security footage. It took half an hour to pull and load on the big screen, and then 12 executives sat in silence and watched the wide shot of the great atrium. The woman in the olive parka coming in out of the snow, the 11-minute wait, the exchange at the desk, and then the shove, quick and ugly and unmistakable, and the tumbler going off the edge and bursting across the marble, and the woman straightening and folding her hands and walking to the bench to wait. Gordon Price put his face in his hands. When he finally spoke, what he said was not eloquent, but it was accurate. $40 million, he said, to no one for a room she'd already paid for. Marissa was summoned to the corporate office in Calgary by a message to her personal phone at 9:15 because her work phone had been remotely locked at 9 sharp. She drove down the mountain once the highway reopened and arrived in full lodge uniform, out of instinct the way certain professionals reach for the uniform as armor. Security at the lobby desk asked for her access card and took it quietly, without drama, which was somehow worse than drama would have been. Her email was dead. Her scheduling access was gone. She was walked to a small windowless meeting room where 2 people from Human Resources and 1 from Legal sat, waiting with faces that were professionally neutral and thoroughly final. There was a pitcher of water on the table. No one offered to pour it. She still believed in those first few minutes that it was a misunderstanding, that a difficult guest had filed an exaggerated complaint, that 9 years of service would speak louder than 1 night's report. She said as much. She said the woman had been disruptive and that she had maintained order. The HR representative said nothing. The lawyer opened a folder and slid a single printed still from the lobby camera across the table. The shove, frozen, the tumbler in the air, the woman's shoulder against the desk. Marissa looked at it. Something happened to her face. It was the first moment in the whole thing that she truly understood the specificity of what she had done, and to whom, and where, and on how many cameras. And even then, what crossed her face first was not remorse. It was the white shock of a person discovering that the world is not, after all, arranged in her favor. Outside, the story was already moving. The footage from the guest's phone had merged with the lodge's own camera logs and gone everywhere. These things go when a story has every necessary element in the right proportions. The response was instant and total. People who had never set foot in a luxury resort, who had no stake in the hospitality business at all, found themselves furious in the clean, righteous way that arrives when something long suspected suddenly becomes undeniable. And then came the part that the communications office had no prepared answer for. A national advocacy group published an open letter pointing to 3 earlier incidents at Coronet Properties over the previous 4 years, all settled internally and quietly, none ever acknowledged. Suddenly visible in the light of this one, those earlier cases turned a single bad night into a pattern, and every statement the company released afterward was read against that pattern and found wanting. 2 corporate sponsors paused their partnerships pending review, which is the language companies use when they are deciding how quickly to leave. The company went quiet, and quiet in a crisis reads as guilt, whether it is or not. Maxine gave no interviews that day. Her publicist confirmed only that Ms. Okoro was aware of developments and would speak at the appropriate time. The appropriate time, decided in consultation with Desmond, was 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Once the news cycle had been allowed to organize itself around the documented facts and the public's own conclusions, so that her voice, when it came, would land on ground already shaped in her direction, rather than ground she had to shape herself. She appeared on a national business program, seated in a gray chair in a dark blazer, her own gray-streaked hair framed by studio light, looking exactly like what she was, composed, accomplished, entirely unhurried. The anchor, a veteran named Patricia Vaughn, who had interviewed premiers and founders and learned to read people by their posture, would say afterward that Maxine Okoro was among the most controlled subjects she had sat across from in 2 decades. She did not cry. She did not perform outrage. When Patricia asked her to describe what had happened, she described it the way a person gives testimony, not the way a person asks for sympathy. And then Patricia asked her, gently, whether some viewers might see this as one very wealthy woman using enormous power to ruin a company over a single bad encounter, whether the punishment fit the moment. Maxine was quiet for a beat. "I understand why it looks that way," she said. "So let me be precise. I didn't pull $300 million because one person shoved me into a desk. One person can have a terrible night. I pulled it because when I looked closer, I found that what happened to me in that lobby had happened in those buildings before. More than once, to people who didn't own a stake in the company and couldn't make a single phone call about it. They were told it was handled. It was buried. The shove is just the part that finally happened on camera in front of someone with the means to make it cost something." She paused. "I'm not interested in revenge. Revenge is small. I'm interested in price. For a very long time, treating people like that was free. I decided to make it expensive." It was the line that got replayed several 100,000 times in the days that followed. Patricia asked whether she would reconsider given how Coronet had responded. Maxine said she had withdrawn and would not return. She said she intended to put that capital, and more, into a smaller outfit that had approached her the year before, Cedarline, a worker-owned collective of mountain lodges scattered across the interior, places where the people who cleaned the rooms and carried the bags actually held shares in the business and were treated accordingly. She named it. Its tiny, almost uncovered valuation began to climb the moment the segment aired, and she said that among the conditions of her investment would be a full rebuild of how staff were hired, trained, and held to account, not as damage control, but as the foundation. Because dignity in service should never be something a guest has to earn by proving how much they're worth. What followed for Coronet was not one event, but a slow unraveling, thread by thread, until the whole weave showed what it had always been made of. Gordon Price resigned, in a letter that spoke of wanting more time with his family, which is the language of men who have not been given a choice. The board commissioned an external audit of its culture, a decision driven less by conscience than by the arithmetic of liability, which now and then produces the same action that conscience would. 3 of the largest institutional shareholders demanded emergency briefings. The kind of request that means explain to us why we shouldn't sell, and 2 of them sold anyway. Marissa, already suspended, was let go. She stopped going out by the end of the week, not from any instruction, but because her face had become recognizable to strangers in a way it had never been and would not stop being for a long time. She had not anticipated that, because she had not anticipated most of what followed, because all of it rested on a premise she had never genuinely entertained, that the woman in the thrift store parka was not beneath her. She had believed she was right with the full, settled certainty of a belief so deep it had never once required examination. She had believed it on the floor of the lobby, and in the windowless room, and in a thinning, increasingly desperate way through the first 2 days of public attention. And now, at the end of the week, she sat in her apartment and watched the interview on her phone, and felt that certainty, which had been the floor under her whole life, simply drop away. What was left behind it did not have a name yet. She sent a request through a lawyer for a meeting. She expected nothing. The answer came in 3 days. Yes, 1 hour, place and time to follow. Maxine's offices took up part of a floor in a plain building downtown, clean and spare, and notably free of anything designed to impress. Marissa arrived in no uniform, carrying nothing. She had rehearsed for 3 days, and discarded all of it in the elevator, because none of it sounded like the truth. And she had finally understood that the truth was the only thing that would do. Maxine was already seated when an assistant showed her in, a cup of coffee in front of her, her phone face down, her attention given to the room so completely that Marissa found it almost harder to bear than coldness would have been. Marissa sat. She looked at her hands. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known who Maxine was, and she heard, even as the words left her, how badly they landed, the way they slid into exactly the wrong place, because she had offered her own ignorance as the thing that should soften it. Maxine set down her coffee. She did not raise her voice. "There it is," she said. "That's the whole thing, right there. You didn't know who I was, and you've brought it to me like it helps you." She let that sit. You think respect is something people earn first and receive afterward, that it waits until you've decided what they're worth. I have been on the receiving end of that exact look since I was a girl. From teachers, from loan officers, from interviewers reading a resume they liked until the person attached to it walked in. Not because of anything I'd done, because of what I looked like and what they'd already decided that meant. She was quiet a moment. You weren't cruel because you knew something about me. You were cruel because you were certain, and you weren't worried for 1 second about being wrong. That's the part. You weren't even a little worried about being wrong. Marissa was crying by then. She had not noticed it start, and she did not have the composure left to stop it. "Can you forgive me?" she asked, and the words came out broken in the middle. Maxine looked at her for a long time. "I don't know," she said at last. "That's an honest answer. I don't know yet." She stood. "What I do know is that what you do from here matters more than what I decide. People are watching you now. Whether you like it or not, show them something." And the meeting was over. Camille got a call 4 weeks after the night of the storm, from a number she didn't recognize and almost didn't answer. The voice was warm and direct and belonged to Joelle, who explained without ceremony that Ms. Okoro had an opening for a director of guest experience on the new Cedar Line partnership, and that she had asked for Camille by name. The interview took 40 minutes. Maxine asked her why she had sent that report at 20 to 1 in the morning when she'd been told twice to leave it alone. Camille thought about it and said that she'd known what she saw was wrong, and she'd also known that if she went to sleep without doing anything about it, she'd wake up the next day already having become someone she didn't want to be. Maxine nodded slowly and asked nothing more on the subject. The offer came the next morning. Camille accepted it in under an hour. The world moved on the way it does, not cleanly, not into anything as tidy as resolution, but forward. Coronet stabilized eventually at a lower altitude, found replacement financing on unkind terms, and began a long, unglamorous restructuring that left it considerably smaller. A new chief executive arrived with a mandate to change the actual texture of the company's behavior rather than its messaging. 2 projects that are very different and very often confused for each other. Marissa found work in another city, in a field that had nothing to do with hotels, and whether the quiet that surrounded her new life was the quiet of accountability genuinely accepted, or only the quiet of consequence endured, remained, even to her, unclear on most mornings. And Maxine went back to work. She wrote dignity into the bones of the Cedar Line Agreement in ways that had never been written into a hospitality deal in quite that form. Independent reporting channels that bypassed a guest's direct supervisor, quarterly outside reviews of how staff treated the people who could do nothing for them, senior bonuses tied to how the lowest paid guests and the loneliest travelers were actually treated. She visited the lodges herself, unannounced, in the parka, and watched how the front desk handled the elderly man who couldn't manage his own bag, and the young mother traveling alone with a baby and a toddler, and the nervous first-time guest who admitted at the counter that he'd never done this before, and she watched all three of them be met with a patience that looked real rather than performed. It was the simplest possible standard. It turned out to be remarkably rare. Months later, she stood at a podium in a community center in the North End neighborhood where she'd grown up, opening a scholarship program for first-generation engineering students. And she spoke without notes. She told the young people in the room that real power, not the borrowed kind that comes from a title or a uniform or an assumption about who belongs where, but the kind that stays after everything else is stripped away, comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when the whole room is doing its level best to make you forget. She said, "It takes most of a life to learn that, and it is worth every winter of the learning." She said the quietest person in the room is very often the one paying the closest attention, and that the person paying the closest attention is very often the one who, at the moment that matters most, knows precisely what to do. She did not linger when the room rose. She had never known what to do with applause. She found Joelle waiting in the corridor with her coat and a paper cup of coffee at exactly the right temperature. And they went out the back into a gray prairie afternoon where the car was waiting, and for the first block neither of them spoke. Through the window, Maxine watched the street go by. A hospital worker waiting at a bus stop with her eyes closed and her head tipped back, resting in whatever small increment the day had given her. And she thought about all the women who never made it into the story, the ones who absorbed it and went back to work the next morning, and what she owed them, and what any of us owe each other when we find ourselves, for whatever reason, holding enough to require the world to be a little more decent than it wants to be. She thought, don't waste it. Use it carefully, exactly, in service of the plainest truth there is, that every person who comes in out of the snow deserves to be treated like a person, fully and without condition, before they have proven a single thing. It is the oldest idea there is. People keep forgetting it, and other people keep paying for the forgetting. And once in a while, the world gets reminded in terms it cannot look away from. She hoped this had been one of those times. With the earned, unhurried optimism of someone who had watched things change slowly and understood what slow change actually looks like, she believed that it was.